Welcome to Lyric Lab Poetry. My name is Martin Jago, and in this video we are exploring what we can learn as poets and what poetry can take from the visual arts and from visual artists. That might at first seem counterintuitive. We're going to dig in and explore this together. First of all, just two things I want to mention. The inspiration for this video comes from two very distinct places for me. The first one is something I encounter from time to time when I meet poets who come from a different artistic tradition. Just as I do, I come from a theatre background, and there may be habits and tics that I've inherited from my sort of background in theatre that I bring with me into poetry. And I sometimes observe that the same is true in a different way for poets that come from a background rooted in visual arts, or poets who maybe are thinking about the page as canvas, for example. And I'm not sure whether the Canadian poet M. Norbert Philippe comes from a visual arts background, but I do know that the poetic work Zong is absolutely extraordinary, and it relates to the most viscerally and egregiously sort of brutal example of colonial violence that you could possibly imagine. In 1781, the slave ship Zong, the owners decided to collect insurance on that ship, and they decided the only way to do that really was to get rid of the slaves. They essentially murdered the slaves by throwing them into the ocean and drowning them. It's incredibly shocking. There's one extant document, and Zong uses that document to as a sort of text that it sort of fragments and scatters and reimagines as it tells this story. And the way it explores through poetry is the most, for me, was arresting, because knowing a little about the history of Zong, and Zong, by the way, was the name of that ship, interestingly, a misspelling, not by the poet, but when the ship was being repainted, the original name was Zorg, and that was misspelled and renamed Zong. Zorg, irony of ironies, is the Dutch word, because this was a Dutch slave ship, the Dutch word for care, which seems sort of brutally sort of ironic. So knowing a little about that and the history behind the poetic artwork, I was not expecting to find what I found when I opened the pages of this wonderful book. And let's just take a quick look. I can show you how text appears on the page, sometimes like a scattering, a fragmentation, and these shapes that seem to sort of mirror one another on opposite pages. Sometimes the use of sort of cursive font. Sometimes there seems to be some sort of formal element to the staging of text on the page. At other times, later in the text, there's a kind of erasure that takes place as language, as words simply fade on the canvas of the page. And that's the idea, I think, that I want to come to, the idea of the page as canvas. And that was initially what has inspired me, along with two very well-known critical essays on poetry and poetry's place in art. I guess we might call that sort of poetic ontology, what a poem is. And the first of those essays is way back in 1766 by a man called Gotthold Ephraim Lessing. And Lessing was a philosopher and a poet and a dramaturg. Of course, the word dramaturg goes all the way back to ancient Greece, but he coined the phrase or the word dramaturgy with a different essay, I think a few years after the essay I'm talking about here in 1766, which was called Laocoon, an essay on the limits of painting and poetry. And in that essay, very clearly, he sort of separates poetry from visual arts. He says that the painting, the sculpture, is something we experience spatially. You don't walk into an art gallery and look up at the wall and ask the question, what time does this painting begin? And how long will it last? We encounter the painting and the sculpture in a different way, a different mode of encounter to the way we encounter a piece of music, for example, playing on the car radio. We're singing along and we are moving through that piece of art's temporality. So we could really categorize arts in two different distinct places, as Lessing did in that essay. And that was prevailing wisdom for about 100 years or so. Here's one type of art that exists and that we encounter sort of spatially. And then here's another sort of group of art forms that we experience sort of temporally, like music or dance or drama or theatre, or indeed poetry. Now, as you can see, that is something that an artwork like Zong sort of contradicts, because of course what it is asking is for the reader to experience and to encounter the poem in not just temporally. We're not reading from left to right. The first thing we do before I don't have my glasses on, so I literally can't read the words on this page. I am encountering the text on the page as a shape. I'm encountering it spatially. Now, I suppose the first poem that really did that, long before Zong, is a famous poem by the French poet Stéphane Mallarmé. I'm going to butcher the French now. I think the poem was called, let me see if I can get this right, Un coup jamais, le hasard, which translates as a throw or a toss of the dice does not abolish chance. The poem's all about life and how various it is, and life's ambiguities and its arbitrary sort of nature. And one of the things he does is very arresting on the page. The typography of the font is spaced, not maybe in as fragmented as a way as is done, in this kind of 21st century work of art, but certainly it is a real surprise. And it's also a surprise that this happens on the sort of 1800 side of that dividing line, the turn of the century. In a way, what Mallarmé's poem is doing is sort of foretelling modernism, but it's very clearly also contradicting that idea of Lessing from about 100 years before it was created. This is a fascinating thing to me, where poetry sits and poetry's paradox as an art form. So with that in mind, let's just turn to the visual arts for a minute and think about how a visual artist engages with the canvas, for example. Let's say that is their medium, painting, and how they represent or how they approach the thematic elements of what they want to explore thematically, the subject of their painting. Are they doing as a realist painting does, observing and reporting and relating what they see in the most literal sense, closely observing and representing through realism, through a realist lens? And I suppose in the Western classical tradition of art training, going to art school, this is what almost all visual artists start doing, isn't it? Staring at bowls of fruit for hours on end, and hundreds of hours, in fact, carefully detailing and representing in the most literal way the thing they see. And I think that a lot of contemporary poetry does that too, with the prevalence of the lyric eye, centering the poem around that sort of authentic experience, lived experience. And I think this is kind of born out of earlier sort of confessional poetry and traditions in Western poetry. So there is already a relationship I can see that exists in a lot of contemporary poetry. Think about how the Impressionist might encounter that bowl of fruit, or if you were to take a photograph of a small bridge over a small pond with some lilies in it, and then compare that to a painting by Claude Monet on the same subject. What Monet is doing is trying to explore the same thing that the work of realism does, but through perception, through atmosphere. If you think about what the Surrealist would do with that small footbridge and lilies on the pond, or indeed how an abstract artist might encounter through the use of shape and form and color, explore something beyond representation. These are really fascinating areas. So here is your first question, really, is what kind of artist am I? Or rather, how do I see? What is my way of seeing? And the first exercise I want you to use in relation to this question is to take an existing poem or a draft of a poem, and it would be helpful if it was a draft that you were kind of stuck with, maybe early stages, early draft of a poem, a short poem, maybe no longer than 12, 14 lines. And I want you to really think first about visual art and looking at the poem through that lens. And then I want you to rewrite the poem through the lens, through the surrealist lens, through the impressionist lens, or through the abstract lens. What would that poem look like reimagined? It's just a game. We're just playing with language and with the poem on the page in an interesting way. And then after you've done that, return to the original and compare the two. And I think it's very interesting to think about how our default settings, and to challenge them sometimes, opens up new areas for us in terms of the shaping of that poem. Next, I think I'm going to return to the idea of the page as a canvas, because that is a really fascinating way of exploring a poem. I think often when I'm looking at a painting, I'm also thinking about negative space, what I'm being shown by the painter, what I am seeing, and what is left out of the painting that makes it interesting, what the painting does not quite see. And that also relates to the third area, which I'll come to in a moment. But I want you to go back to that poem that you have, that draft of the poem. And your second exercise is to, first of all, remove all the lineation, so the poem just sits on the page as a block of prose, or what would appear to be prose. And then I want you to think about where the emotional weight of the poem is, where the poem is asking you to look first, and maybe then try to, well, not maybe, please actually do this as the second exercise. It's to take the poem and to imagine it on the page in a different way. If you were to visually represent it, using the same words, what are the words that seem to cluster together? Where is the bold type on the page, the kind of the colors that are drawing your eye? Where is their isolation and where is their negative space? Think about white space on the page in the same way that visual artists use negative space. What words stand alone? What words cluster together? And just go for it and go, really sort of wildly experiment, but with purpose, really thinking about those elements in terms of their visual impact, or where the reader's eye needs to attend to the page. The last area I want just to briefly touch on is in relation to perspective. And so often, especially for the last 2,000 years in sort of Western art, it is through the male gaze, isn't it? The lens. But think for a moment about perspective. Because when we look at a piece of visual art, it is the artist that's choosing how that artwork is framed, what the perspective is, what the distance from the subject that's being explored is, and even the sort of angle of perspective, the point of view. Of course, poets do this with point of view, with the speaker, and there's this kind of correlation. I'm just thinking now about the famous 1942 painting Nighthawks by Edward Hopper, because I suspect, it's in the Commons Cultural Lexicon. It is a painting you're probably already familiar with. If you're not, just go right now onto your laptop or computer and search for Nighthawks by Edward Hopper. It's a very famous painting that looks through the windows of a diner, and the perspective is very interesting because we're not pressed up close to the glass. We're not with our noses pressing against the windows of the diner. We're actually across the street from the diner, and slightly elevated the position, the point of view. I wonder why the artist has chosen that particular perspective. what is the artist trying to focus on? Is the artist trying to capture some of the sense of isolation that's happening? It feels to me almost like the sort of goldfish bowl. We are on the outside looking in at this world, and it gives a kind of aesthetic distance, I think, which is really interesting and sort of unsettling, how it speaks to the human condition. So think about your poem and what it's doing in terms of perspective, and then go back and maybe alter significant things about that perspective that you can change. Maybe you want to come from a distance that's kind of a step away and move closer. Maybe you want to change the speaker's point of view or the speaker entirely, and consider the poem from those kind of fresh perspectives. So thank you very much for watching this video. I hope it's kind of, I hope it serves you. I hope it's useful to you. And I think that I will probably continue with a few more videos that look at poetry through the lens of different art forms, because I find it a very rich area for us to explore what we do and how we do it, and to gain new perspectives on how we craft the poem. As always, thank you for watching, and I do hope that you are going to hit the like button and the subscribe button if you haven't yet done that. And also thank you for your patience, because it has been a while since I last posted a video, but I think now I have this idea that's captivating me, this idea of how different art forms can inform our chosen art form, poetry. I'll be back soon with more poetry content. Thank you very much for being here.